Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was supposed to be a weekend of peace. Evan and his two friends, Kyle and Mason, had rented a remote cabin deep in the forests of northern Maine. It was off-grid. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just them, the trees, and the stars. The kind of isolation you only chase when the noise of the world starts to crush you. They arrived late on a Friday, their GPS losing signal miles before the turnoff. By the time they reached the cabin, it was nearly midnight, and the woods seemed to have swallowed all sound. Even their footsteps felt muffled. The trees were tall and ancient, packed so densely they blocked out the moonlight. The only light came from their flashlights and the glow of the cabin windows after they powered on the generator. The first night passed with beers, laughter, and the comfort of isolation. But the forest had a way of changing its tone once you stopped pretending it was just scenery. By Saturday afternoon, Evan started noticing something strange. He wandered farther than the others during a solo hike and found what he first thought was an old hunting shelter, except it wasn't on any map they'd seen. It was a shack, partially collapsed, with bones hanging from its roof. They looked like animal bones, maybe deer. But there was something off about the arrangement, too deliberate, almost like wind chimes. He approached cautiously, snapping a photo with his phone out of habit, even though there was no service. Inside, the floor was covered in a thick mat of moss. Symbols were etched into the wooden walls, circles, eyes, spirals, all carved with something sharp. At the far end, he saw a small open pit dug into the earth like a grave, a fresh one. He told the others, but Kyle shrugged it off as some hunter's weird ritual spot. Probably just a creepy hobby, he laughed, but Mason seemed uneasy. That night, Mason didn't come in from the woods. They searched with flashlights, calling his name for hours. The forest didn't echo, it swallowed sound whole. Eventually, they found Mason's flashlight in the dirt, still on, pointing at a tree that had been stripped of its bark in a spiral pattern. A trail of blood led into the trees. The sheriff didn't come. They hiked out the next morning to find help, only to discover the car had been ransacked. The tires were slashed with what looked like claw marks, not knife cuts, jagged rips like something had torn into them with hooked blades. The radio was dead. Their emergency beacon had been smashed. Evan was convinced someone or something was in the woods, watching them, hunting them. That night, Kyle boarded the cabin door with furniture. Evan stayed up, clutching a hatchet, listening. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the generator cut out. Silence fell like a trap. And then came the scratching, not from the door, but the roof. Soft at first, then faster, scraping, pacing, then a heavy thud. They stared at the ceiling, not moving. When Kyle finally whispered, "We have to leave," it stopped. They waited until dawn. When they opened the door, the world had changed. Dozens of those symbols were carved into the trees surrounding the cabin. None were there the night before. And hanging from a branch just 15 feet away was Mason's jacket, ripped, shredded, and soaked in blood. They never found his body. Evan and Kyle hiked 10 miles through the forest without speaking, too afraid to talk, afraid that something might hear them. When they made it to the nearest ranger station, the officer there went pale as soon as they explained where they'd been. "That area's off limits," he said. "Should have been blocked off years ago after the disappearances. Locals say there's something out there that doesn't like being found, something older than the trees, and once it knows your name, it doesn't forget." Evan moved out of the state a month later. Kyle stopped answering his calls not long after. 2 weeks after that, Evan received a photo in the mail. No return address. Just a picture of that strange shack in the woods, and standing in front of it, arms at his sides, was Mason. Only his face was wrong, too long. His eyes were just pits. And behind him, standing in the shadows of the shack, was something tall, something watching. Evan burned the photo, moved again, changed his name. But every year on the anniversary of that trip, he finds a fresh set of claw marks on his front door. 4 deep rakes, always fresh, always bleeding. He doesn't go near the woods anymore, but he knows it's still out there, and it still remembers.
Story number 2.
In the summer of 2018, a wildlife biologist named Clay Hensley vanished deep in the Green River Valley of Kentucky. His body was never found, but what searchers did uncover has been quietly passed around among locals, never officially acknowledged, but whispered like an infection through the small towns that border that endless, tangled stretch of forest. Clay had been researching the migration patterns of elk and black bear deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest. It was a solo study, something he'd done before, and he was experienced, smart, cautious, well-prepared. According to his sister, he always let people know exactly where he'd be and when he'd return. He even carried a GPS satellite beacon. But on July 3rd, his signal went dead, and he never came home. When rangers and volunteers followed the last ping from his beacon, they found his base camp mostly intact. Tent zipped, food stored safely in a bare canister, backpack resting against a tree. Nothing was ransacked or knocked over. But there was something strange. His boots were still by the fire pit, unlaced. His notebook lay open, soaked from a recent storm, but legible. The final entry read, "Heard whistling again last night. Same pattern, always just after 2 a.m. Not birds, not wind. Too rhythmic, too human." Search dogs picked up a trail heading northeast, away from any marked trail. About 4 miles in, searchers found something even more unsettling. Torn pages of Clay's field journal were tied to tree branches with fishing line, fluttering like flags in the breeze. They were placed precisely about 30 feet apart, like some kind of twisted breadcrumb trail. Most had sketches of wildlife, but a few contained frantic scrawls. Something mimics sounds out here. Not an animal, not a person. And later, last night, it called my name, but wrong. My mother's voice, choked like it was trying too hard. At one point, the searchers reached a clearing where every tree for 20 yards had been stripped of bark, gouged and clawed down to the inner wood. In the center was a shallow pit, filled with bones, small ones, not human. Deer, raccoon, maybe even bobcat. All picked clean, all arranged in an almost circular pattern. No sign of Clay. The dogs refused to go any farther. They whimpered and turned, tails tucked, refusing to advance another step into the woods. A week later, a local hunter named Earl Tate contacted the sheriff's office, claiming he'd seen something in that same area a few months before. He described a figure, hunched and thin, covered in mud and dark hair, standing dead still beside a tree just before dusk. Earl had thought it was a bear until it turned its head toward him and whistled. The whistle was soft, low-pitched, and eerily musical, like someone trying to imitate a lullaby. He ran and never went back. The last piece of the puzzle came from a trail cam that Clay had set up a few hundred yards from his base camp. The footage was corrupted, skipping every few seconds, but one frame, just one, caught something standing just outside the camera's night vision range. Tall, unnaturally thin. Its eyes glowed too high off the ground, and its limbs were too long, arms almost down to its knees. It stood behind a tree, peeking, watching. The timestamp was 2:07 a.m. The official report ruled Clay as missing, presumed dead. But locals still talk about those woods like there's something else in them, something that listens, that mimics, that waits. And some nights, if you're camping deep enough, far from any other human sound, you might hear it too, just after 2 a.m. A whistle, rhythmic, familiar, calling your name.
Story number 3.
In the fall of 2017, 3 friends, Jamie, Tyler, and Lex, decided to spend a weekend hiking and camping deep in the woods of the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas. They were all experienced outdoors people, armed with GPS, emergency radios, and enough food and supplies for 3 days. Their plan was to disconnect from the world and venture into a remote stretch of forest where cell service didn't exist and few people ever wandered. The trail started normal enough, winding through pine-covered ridges and rocky clearings. But around midday on the second day, things started to feel off. They stumbled upon what looked like an old logging road, overgrown and long forgotten. Tyler, the most adventurous of the 3, suggested they explore it. About a mile in, they found remnants of what looked like an old settlement, not on any map, just decaying wooden structures, half swallowed by vines and moss. One of the buildings still had a rusted iron stove and scraps of furniture. The air felt wrong, thick like it was heavier there, and dead quiet. Not even birds. Jamie kept saying they should go back, that the place wasn't right. But Lex was fascinated. She took photos, tried opening drawers, even picked up an old cracked photograph from the floor. It showed a family of 5, their faces oddly smudged out with what looked like charcoal. That night, They camped about half a mile from the settlement. Lex couldn't sleep. She said she kept hearing a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on wood. Tyler brushed it off as branches or woodpeckers. But Jamie heard it too, and it wasn't random. It was slow, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. They decided to leave early the next morning. As they packed up, Lex realized her phone, useless without service, was missing. They spent over an hour searching for it. Tyler finally found it near a tree, standing upright, screen side down, like someone had carefully placed it there. The weird part? The screen was shattered and the flashlight had been turned on. As they started heading back toward the main trail, the forest seemed different. The light had changed. Trees they didn't recognize. Rock formations that hadn't been there the day before. Jamie checked the GPS. It showed them in the same place, but the path ahead just wasn't there. It had disappeared. They argued for hours, eventually deciding to follow the slope of the ridge down, hoping it would lead to a creek they'd passed on their way in. But the deeper they went, the stranger things became. They found another structure, a single-room shack that hadn't been there before, freshly built. And on the wooden door carved deep into the wood was the word "Stay." Lex, who had been silent for over an hour, walked up to the door like she was in a trance. She reached for the handle, but Jamie yanked her back. Inside, they could hear something. Slow breathing, something waiting. They ran. That night, they slept in shifts, back to back, clutching their knives. The tapping returned, closer this time, moving in a slow circle around their tent. Tap, tap, tap. When morning came, Tyler was gone. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints, just his knife, stuck into the ground next to the tent, and the same photograph Lex had picked up at the abandoned settlement, only now there were 6 people in it. Lex screamed. They ran again, faster, not even knowing where they were going. The forest felt like it was closing in on them, trees too close together, sky too dark for morning. Then, just as suddenly, they burst into a clearing, right onto the main trail. It was late afternoon. Jamie checked her GPS. It was working again. The trailhead was less than an hour away. They never found Tyler. No one believed them when they reported what happened. The park rangers said Tyler probably wandered off and got lost. But when the photos from Lex's phone were recovered, they found something strange. In one of the pictures she'd taken at the settlement, behind the trees, partially hidden, was a figure, tall, thin, with no face, watching them. They say sometimes hikers in that part of the Ouachita Mountains still go missing, and that if you wander off the trail and find old buildings where no buildings should be, you might hear a slow, steady tapping like someone knocking just outside your tent. Tap, tap, tap.
Story number 4.
It started as an ordinary camping trip for a group of friends. 5 of them, eager to escape city life for a weekend deep in the woods. They had all heard the stories about the old forest, whispered rumors of people vanishing without a trace, strange noises at night, and shadows that moved against the light. But they laughed it off, chalking it up to local legends designed to scare kids and tourists. Their first day was peaceful. They set up camp near a creek, roasted marshmallows, and told ghost stories by the fire. But as night fell, an eerie stillness settled over the trees, as if the forest was holding its breath. The wind died, the usual sounds of crickets and owls vanished, and an unnatural quiet wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket. Around midnight, one of the friends, Jake, wandered away from the fire to relieve himself. When he didn't return after a long time, the others called for him, but only silence answered. They grabbed flashlights and split up to search, but the woods seemed to swallow their voices and lights alike. After what felt like hours, Jake was nowhere to be found. His phone was on the ground by the creek, screen cracked and dark, but no sign of him. Panic began to seep in. They huddled back the campsite, debating whether to stay put or try to find their way out. That's when the first screams ripped through the trees, Jake's voice filled with terror. They followed the sound deeper into the forest, hearts pounding. But as they pushed forward, the trees seemed to close around them, branches scraping like claws, roots tangling their feet. The flashlight beams flickered and died one by one. Suddenly, the screaming stopped. Instead, a chilling silence replaced it. Then came the whispering, a hissing murmur just beyond the edge of hearing, filled with words they couldn't understand but felt deep in their bones. Shadows danced just out of sight, moving with a life of their own. Panic turned to dread as they realized they were being hunted. One by one, they disappeared. First Emily, pulled into the darkness by unseen hands. Then Mark, swallowed whole by the twisted roots that seemed to grow and pulse like living creatures. Sarah was last, stumbling through the forest alone, bleeding, desperate to find a way out. At dawn, a lone hiker found Sarah, eyes wild and clothes torn, muttering incoherent warnings about the forest feeding on them, about things that never let go. She was taken to the hospital but never fully recovered. The others were never seen again. To this day, hikers avoid that part of the woods, and locals warn that some places aren't meant to be explored, that the forest remembers and it takes what it wants, leaving only silence and shadows behind.